Hi, my name is David Cranford, and I'm an assistant state archaeologist with the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology. I want to thank the Archaeological Society of South Carolina for the invitation to speak with you today. And unfortunately, we can't be there with each other in person, but hopefully that's just around the corner. I was asked to speak about some of my recent research on stonefish weirs in the Southeast. The title of my talk today is Where the Water is Shallow and the Current is Strong. And this is a reference to a 1705 publication by Robert Beverly, and it is one of the earliest accounts of these stonefish weirs that we have. And I believe it sets a good context for us talking about fish weirs in the Southeast. Let me advance this. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the North Carolina Weir Archaeological project that I started in around 2018 when I joined the Office of State Archaeology. After a brief background of that project, I'll talk about fish weirs in general, the why, the what, the where, the when, and who. And conclude by talking about opportunities for future research and some of the collaborative parts of this project that I've been working on. So the North Carolina Weir Archaeological project is a side project that I've created in 2018 when I joined the Office of State Archaeology. As part of my job, I provide environmental review for several counties in the southern Piedmont of North Carolina. And while I was getting used to the new job, I was realizing that as I was reviewing projects near some of these larger rivers, that I was coming across fish weirs when I was looking at some of these old maps, but most of them had not been identified as archaeological sites. And so I got to thinking that these were, that this probably had some, that we were not providing all of the detailed recommendations we had, we could, because we just weren't, they weren't showing up when we were doing our kind of background review. And so during my lunch hours, I started just creating a Google map with some of these locations. First of all, in my review area, then I broadened out into the state and to the broader region. As this project kind of got off the ground, I developed some goals, mainly to create an inventory of fish weir locations, not just within North Carolina, but in the broader region. I hope that by investigating and documenting these weir locations that I could look at the spatial distribution and the range of variation within these fish weir features. I wanted to document these locations, but by doing so, allow us to potentially make recommendations and learn about some of the terrestrial sites that might be located nearby, whether those be village sites or processing sites. That was one of the underlying reasons for kind of embarking on this process. A side benefit of our side goal of this project is to create public awareness and to aid in the preservation of these sites, which constitute a really important part of our cultural landscape. So why do we study weirs? As I mentioned, they tend to be often overlooked cultural and archaeological features because they are in the middle of rivers, sometimes larger rivers. They tend not to be directly impacted by the types of projects that we normally review in our office. And while some weirs have been documented archaeologically, most have not. As a submerged archaeological resource, fish weirs are actually protected by state law, and it's an entirely reasonable thing for us to be looking at and trying to identify, so we can kind of consider them in all of our archaeological recommendations and preservation efforts. beyond just preserving them as sites, they can actually provide a lot of information about how past communities interacted with their environment, both during the pre-colonial period, but also throughout the historic period. This is a really good time to be looking at fish weirs because there's a whole host of new and developing technologies that are giving us new ways to document and research these kinds of sites. And probably most important of all, fish weirs remain an important part of a cultural landscape. Not only to folks who live around these sites or who have family members who used to fish these weirs, but whole communities. The American Indian community have vested interest in seeing a lot of these sites preserved and documented as well. So what are fish weirs? Once you start looking at the historical and archaeological background of these features, you'll come across a number of names. People refer to these features as fish weirs or fish traps, fish falls, fish dams, and in many cases they're all talking about the same kinds of features. But for the sake of this presentation and the fish weir project that I'm going to be using weirs to talk generally about the permanent structures that we find, whether those be the stone lines that we find in submerged in rivers or stakes that kind of functioned in the same way. And fish traps I refer to mainly as the kind of movable elements in a lot of ways, and a lot of times you see basket traps or conical cone shaped traps that were put at the kind of the apex of these V-shaped weirs, and those are what I usually refer to as the fish traps, while the weirs are the more permanent parts of these structures. But in the most basic sense, a fish weir can be any structure built in water to funnel, block, or otherwise direct fish into an enclosure or a trap, making them easier to catch. In a very basic way, these were mass capture devices, so that it would be easier to capture and go fishing. There are three main types of fish weirs that relate to how water flows through them or how fish are interacting with the man-made structures. And this typology really comes from John Conaway, who I'll talk about a little bit later. But essentially, he came up with the idea that there are three main types: flowing stream weirs, which is the main focus of the North Carolina Fish Weir Archaeological Project, and the ones that I will talk about most today. Tidal weirs that rely on the changing tide and the flow of water through near estuaries and the coast. And longshore weirs, which really rely on the movement of fish themselves. And I'll talk a little bit about these in more detail. Again, as I mentioned, flowing stream weirs are the ones that I am most interested in with this project. And I am really interested in documenting the stone fish weirs. As you can see, the one up in the upper left is a stone fish weir from Randolph County, North Carolina, and the other picture is a stone weir seen from a bridge near the Mayo River State Park. Tidal weirs function in slightly different ways. They can look very similar. This one has the same kind of V shape, but it relies on the flow of tidal waters. When the tide is high, fish swim up and up behind these wings, and as the tide goes out, the water lowers, water level goes down, and they get trapped and are easily collected. And this is one that was recently in the news a few years ago from Wales. And it was also discovered using Google Earth, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. Here is a tidal weir from Fiji with the same idea that when the tide goes out, fish get trapped behind these stone walls and are a little easier to catch. Here's another one from Taiwan. You can see the intricate designs with the wings and the pins and the enclosures at the end. Longshore weirs operate slightly differently, and they usually have a long line that attached to shore that direct fish towards an enclosure, but are not necessarily relying on the change in tides to get the fish to go in. And so this is an example. Hopefully you can see the arrow-shaped weirs. These are examples are from Bahrain. Here are examples from Micronesia. You can see the arrow-shaped pattern, and probably one of the most photographed fish weirs out there is the double heart weir from Taiwan. It's a really gorgeous looking weir, and it's again a longshore type weir. Fish weirs can be made out of a variety of materials. Most often we either see wooden stake or brush weirs being depicted historically and identified archaeologically, or they're made out of stacked stone, usually in the shape of a V that would direct and funnel fish to kind of the apex, where there would be a community members with spears or traps and otherwise. So these are the kind of the two main material types that we often see. But if you, here's an old postcard from the Asheville area showing a stone fish weir with wooden elements. So it's not, it's actually fairly common to have multiple material types being used. Obviously, in archaeological contexts, the wooden elements are less durable and may not survive as well as the stone, stacked stones. But the possibility for wooden stakes or wooden structures within stone weirs is certainly possible. So this is not the first attempt to study fish weirs. There's a long history of looking at individual weirs, but these are just a few of the past researchers who have looked at a more systematic way of at fish weirs. I'll highlight John Conaway, who wrote the literal book on fish weirs, and it's a tome. It's huge, and it's really well done. He focused mostly on wooden stake weirs that he had encountered and documented in Mississippi, but he provided a really solid look at a global perspective of fish weirs that had been published on at that point, and provided a huge stepping stone for this current project. So there are a number of obstacles to studying fish weirs. The first being that they are very difficult to access, especially during high water. They don't kind of conform to the typical survey strategies that most archaeologists are used to. And when you do find them, they can be very difficult to date or to assign to a particular cultural period, especially stone weirs that don't have readily identifiable datable material. And like I mentioned, the weirs don't typically get impacted by most compliance projects and are less likely to be included in systematic surveys. And because they at least the stone weirs don't have very many associated artifacts, they tend to be less glamorous. There's just not a whole lot you can say about an individual stone weir, as opposed to beyond the fact that it might be prehistoric and it might have also been used during the historic period. It's not always satisfying to just spend a lot of time trying to figure out where, how, as much as you can say about a fish weir. So the pictures that I have on this slide are from Town Creek Indian Mound in North Carolina. And the picture on top is a picture from 1937 where locals are actively using a fish weir right beside the site. And this was taken at the very beginning of archaeological investigations at Town Creek, which is one of the better known Mississippian sites in North Carolina. And despite this, we know very little about the weir itself. We know a lot more about Town Creek itself, but we don't have a good understanding of, beyond this picture, what relationship that weir had. We don't know if it was purely a historic era feature or whether this was one that had gotten a prehistoric one that was repurposed throughout the 18th and 19th century. So this is just one example for why it can sometimes be easy to overlook fish weirs. The approach that I took with this project was to use Google Earth, which most of you are probably familiar with. Google Earth, its predecessor, Keyhole, was first available only in 2001, and it wasn't officially launched publicly until 2005. And one of the key features that I use, this historical imagery feature, wasn't introduced until 2009. And so this is a relatively new tool in doing kind of regional survey. It's the 21st century version of armchair archaeology. When I started doing this, I would I'd find a river, start adjusting going through the historical imagery that Google Earth has available, and trying to find the right time of year, right water level, so that I could more easily identify potential weirs. One of the things that I noticed with Google Earth is that the historical imagery typically only goes back to about 1993 for most locations. Could be a little older in some locations. Some rural areas don't have much coverage at all. And the resolution and visibility varies a lot based on its location, the time of year the satellite was overhead, and the river level. So even though there can be 15, 20 historical images of that particular area that you're looking at, maybe one or two actually are have a high enough quality, high enough resolution, and were captured at a time where the river was low enough for fish weirs to be visible. So my experience has been that really most of the locations that I have found, really you couldn't have done this before 2012 because the resolution just wasn't good enough to really identify some of these weirs. So using Google Earth provides a little bit, I had to question what the limitations of using this as a tool were and try to identify some of my potential bias. And I certainly recognize that there's a bias towards larger order streams due to just what I can see on Google Earth. Smaller streams have a lot of tree cover. Even during the winter time when the leaves are off, it's hard to see clearly. And there are just some rural areas that just don't have the high enough resolution to make good determinations on potential features. So this is not a foolproof method, but it certainly has yielded some good results so far. So I just want to give you an example of what I'm talking about. And so this is a screen capture of Google Earth, and for this particular fish weir location, the earliest image was available was from January 1993. As I scrolled through October 2005, you can clearly see that there's a fish weir feature with two V-shaped components, but you can tell that the picture is very pixelated, not very high quality, but you can certainly tell that there's something there. By October 2008, we get a much clearer view, and we can make some identification of this fish weir. Now, as time goes by, the resolution gets much better, but as you can see, if we were to only be looking at the imagery from April 2018, we would never see this fish weir. The river is just too high. So you really have it's an iterative process sometimes by going through and looking at the historical imagery over and over again over the same stretch to make sure you haven't missed anything. So through going and looking for fish weirs, I have kind of developed a tentative fish weir type. I've identified 5 main forms that fish weirs in the Southeast tend to come in. The first being kind of a single wing. As you see, it's just a line of rocks. It may have a small tail on the kind of the near side, but for the most part, they're a single line of stones that are directing fish towards one bank or the other. The most common type that we see is this simple V-shaped form where it's funneling fish who are coming downstream into a central V location where they could then be tracked. And this is certainly by far the most common. Here's a variation on that V shape, the compound V shape. As you can see, there's still a central V, but the wings are more perpendicular to the riverbank. Another type that we see some is a V shape with a shoot or a kind of elongated apex, like you can see in fish weir number 142 here. And another type that we see fairly common is a multi-V or W-shaped weir. And as you can see, 31AN201 is an extremely well-preserved example of this kind of multiple V or W-shaped weir. And each one of those V's could have had its own, or would have had its own trap at the apex of those V's. Some of the other sources I used beyond Google Earth for documenting weirs have been historical maps and navigational charts. The Army Corps of Engineers did some early mapping before many of these larger streams were dammed and to create reservoirs, which are effectively make any potential weirs there invisible to Google Earth. early travelers' accounts, archaeological reports, and even citizen science. I've been contacted by numerous folks in the community who say, hey, I think there's a weir near my house, and I would look it up, and sometimes it was one that I already had identified, sometimes they are not, and I can they can provide me with better pictures than I would be able to see with Google Earth. And so that's a very useful tool. I've also been trying to make this research available to potential researchers in other states and within the state, and to students who can use this information to identify and better document weirs in their own location. So those are some of the sources. So where are stonefish weirs within North Carolina and the broader region? It should come as no surprise that this research has shown that most fish weirs are in swift flowing streams and rivers above the fall line. So these are these features, these stone fish weirs, are closely tied to the Appalachian physiographic zone, both in the mountains and in the Piedmont. When you go below the fall line, rivers tend to slow down, and the stone fish weirs just don't function in the same way. I'm not saying that there are not fish weirs, or there were never fish weirs in these locations below the fall line, but I think they would have been different types of fish weirs. So, and the ones that we are not as easily observable by Google Earth. They tend to be found near shoals, islands, natural rock formations within these rivers. And as I mentioned before, as far as I have been able to find, that they are confined not exclusively to larger order streams, but that's where I have found most of them are located. And again, this might be a bias against smaller streams that are just harder to see through Google Earth. But it's entirely possible that this is a real cultural pattern, and that other types or methods of fishing were more more likely or more efficient on smaller streams. So the Yadkin-Petey River in North Carolina has by far the highest concentration of stone fish weirs of any river in the eastern U.S., though there are other notable concentrations of fish weirs in places like Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Georgia. And you can probably see the map below this, or behind this slide. There are a lot of man-made reservoirs along some of the major rivers that no doubt had large concentrations of fish weirs in the past, but are effectively invisible and inundated by these reservoirs. So I certainly made no claim that I found all of the fish weirs, but by my count so far, I found over close to 870 fish weirs. The majority of those being in North Carolina. That might be a bias towards the place that I've looked the most, but I've made a concerted effort to look in these other areas, these other states along the Appalachian physiographic zone, to identify weirs in those states. As you can see, Georgia and Pennsylvania and North Carolina have the most representative of the states of where I've looked. Here's another view. This is a density map showing kind of the concentrations of these fish weirs. this kind of leads us to our next question. Talked about why, we've talked about what and where. Now we talk about when. How old are some of these stone fish weirs? I've mentioned before how difficult it is to date some of these features. For those fish weir sites that have been dated, and they are mostly wooden stake weirs, we have evidence that they go back through the woodland into the Archaic period, and potentially earlier, though we don't have good evidence for all of the weirs that have been identified. It's important to remember that most of these stone fish weirs likely had a very complicated use life with multiple construction and reconstruction and abandonment episodes, and were used in many cases by multiple groups over a long period of time. One of the ways I tried to get at this question of dating weirs is by using the North Carolina State site file data that I have access to from the office. And so what I did was created a search radius around each weir of about 500 meters, and looked at what sites we had previously recorded around those fish weirs, and looked at those sites and what component level and phase level details we had about those sites. And this is the information that I was able to pull. It's important to note that this is not saying that all sites within 500 meters of a fish weir site were in any way related to them, but I think that this gives us a sense for what kinds of sites may have been occupied when fish weirs were active. As you can see, archaic sites are well represented, as are woodland period sites, and we know from historic accounts that many of these potentially prehistoric, pre-colonial weirs were reoccupied and reused during the historic period. And in the chart below, you can see a breakdown of kind of the subphase of those sites. This is an interesting case. I had a citizen contact me about, he saw some of my work on fish weirs and brought this particular piece of this particular artifact to my office, and I was able to 3D model it. This is what I believe to be a PD style ceramic pitcher. He allegedly found it within, he was wading out and was found this ceramic artifact in the weir itself. And what's particularly interesting is that this, as the crow flies, less than, I think, 5 miles from Town Creek Indian Mound, and it resembles the PD style. Now, it's important to note that fish weirs and all artifacts associated with them are considered state property and protected by state law by General Statute 121, subsection 22. So we don't encourage anybody to go out and look for artifacts or to disturb fish weirs in any way, but this may be an indication that this particular weir has its kind of founding or at least use during the Mississippian period in this location. So this is an interesting kind of anecdotal piece of information about this particular weir. All right, so we've arrived at the who. Who made and used fish weirs? Not surprisingly, we have archaeological and ethnohistoric evidence that demonstrate that weirs were really used extensively by both American Indian communities as well as early European settlers up through about the 1940s, when the last fish weirs were outlawed. There are state laws that go back to the 18th and 19th centuries that limited fish weirs being built and operated in navigable streams, but we know that they were being used right up through the 1900s. So, and again, we know that many of these fish weirs had very complicated use lives. And I just wanted to provide one case study. This is the Allman Weir near Webster, North Carolina. And it actually is one of the best preserved examples in Western North Carolina. You see it's it's kind of a simple V shape. The flow of this river is actually going towards the north. And it's named for the Allman family, and the current owner is the third generation of Allman family to own this land. And it was reportedly present when the original settler, Polk Allman, acquired the land in the 1870s. Presumably it was built by Cherokee community members at some point in the past. This Allman Weir was used extensively throughout that period. It was effectively destroyed in a big flood in 1940 and was rebuilt until the family stopped using it in the mid-1940s when fish weirs like this were outlawed. The family reports that this fish weir produced truckloads of fish at different times of the year, specifically the fall migration of species like the red horse, suckers, and they even caught an occasional trout. But this goes to show you the complicated lives of these structures, as well as how productive of features that they could be for communities, or for families who live near them. I have been fortunate to have made contact with other researchers, people who are interested in studying and documenting more fish weirs, both here in North Carolina and across Tennessee, Florida, and Pennsylvania. And these are pictures from a colleague in Tennessee who recently went out and did some on-the-ground documentation of some fish weirs, including finding potentially wooden elements within this fish weir. So that's exciting that there may be opportunities to get radiocarbon dates some of these features. I also did a little bit of experimental archaeology. As you can see in this painting, this is from the title slide. Typically you see, or a common image that you see, are these conical baskets that would be put at the point of the V to capture fish that were trapped in the fish weir. And so I had access to some native river cane and tried my hand at making a very simple conical fish trap, and tried it out. And one thing that I became aware of as I actually put it in the very cold water is that these would need to be weighted down or staked down in order for them to not just float away. And if they were staked down into the stream or river bottom, that's a potential of some more organic material that might be dated. So even though we may not be able to see all the components of a fish weir when we see them from Google Earth, there's the potential that there are datable elements still preserved. That's my hope, at least. Some future goals for the Weir Archaeological Project. I hope to get to a point of nominating individual weirs or potentially a multiple property listing for fish weirs on the National Register of Historic Places to make sure that these locations have recognition and some level of protection. I want to continue to provide this information to researchers and interested public to make sure that this inventory can keep growing and we can get more information about these individual weirs. I think we can also start deploying new technology. I'm really excited about the potential for drone-based bathymetric LiDAR mapping to get high-resolution 3D models of these submerged features. LiDAR is light detection and ranging, and typically terrestrial LiDAR uses a red laser that would not penetrate the water column, but bathymetric LiDAR uses a dual laser, one that has a blue-green spectrum that would be able to get through water, and I'm excited about that as a potential way to document fish weirs. And then in the bottom picture, there's some research that shows that ground penetrating radar is capable of producing data from fresh water. So you might find me in a little dinghy taking our new GPR unit out on the water to try to figure out if we can find some fish weirs. I'd also eventually like to do some targeted archaeological survey of areas that are adjacent to known weir sites to see if we can find processing sites or village sites that might provide and yield some more information about these sites. And finally, I hope to eventually, my grand hope is to excavate a weir itself. There's a whole host of logistical problems, as you can imagine, about digging a site in a swift flowing stream. But that is one thing that I hope would be possible in the future. So that's all I have prepared. And I'm told that if there are any questions, I'm available to answer them after the fact. But thank you for your time and attention. Thank you.